This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. As multiple investigations into Russian interference in the U.S. election proceed, rhetoric in some political circles has taken a decidedly Cold War cast. 30 years after Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan signed a nuclear arms treaty that effectively ended the arms race, Russia seems well on its way to regaining evil empire status in much of the American media. Our guest today had a front row seat as post-Soviet Russian history unfolded. Jack Matlock served as U.S. ambassador in Moscow from 1987 to 1991, one of the most consequential periods in U.S.-Russian relations. Since retiring from government service, he's remained a keen observer of all things Russian, holding teaching positions at Duke, Columbia, Princeton, Mount Holyoke, and Hamilton College. Ambassador Matlock, welcome to International Focus.
Glad to be here.
Well, you are a scholar not only of the political history of Russia, but of the culture as well. So I'd like to start with kind of an open-ended question. How do you think Russians see themselves in the world?
I think they see themselves as, well, as an important culture, an important country, which has been put upon and predicted by the United States. You know, even in the Soviet period, it was very clear that the most admired country in the Soviet Union, or the Soviet people, was the United States. Now, and they didn't believe a lot of the propaganda that they heard about them. They thought, I think, genuinely, that when they threw off communism, they were going to be accepted as part of what we call the Western world. I think it may be a misnomer, but what we call the Western world, and they feel that we have been not only treating them unfairly, but humiliating them. And, you know, I think you're getting a reaction to that. There is a basic anti-Americanism today in Russia, which didn't exist among the people in the Soviet Union, even in some of the worst days of the Cold War.
So you've made the point elsewhere that the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union are by no means the same thing. What do you mean by that?
Well, first of all, the Cold War ended before the Soviet Union collapsed. And the Cold War ended not in a victory of the West, but in a negotiated end, which occurred as Gorbachev was throwing off the communist system, trying to democratize the country. Then the attempt to democratize the country and removing the controls that had been on it before got out of hand, and the country actually fell apart, one can say, but not because of Western pressure and not because we demanded it. As a matter of fact, we Americans were trying to help Gorbachev get a voluntary federation of most of the Soviet Union. We would have preferred that, but it happened for internal reasons. Now, what people apparently have perceived, this all happened so quickly and unexpectedly for most people that they conflate the end of the Cold War with the end of the Soviet Union. And then to make matters worse, they say, we won. After all, we survived, the Soviet Union didn't. But that's, you know, that puts it almost everything backwards. And now the Russian people and the others of the Soviet Union went through very difficult times in the 90s. The economy had virtually collapsed, and people's savings were wiped out by inflation. people were looked at it and said, oh, this is democracy. Well, they say, if that's democracy, that's not what we want. And the fact is that I think the Russians, obviously, like every other people, they are going to make the decisions about their future. And what they have resented has been the patronizing and even insulting attitude that American governments and much of their media has taken toward them.
So in that immediate post-Soviet era, there were a lot of privations for the Russian people. And perhaps one of the most iconic things was a program by which American poultry was sent to Russia. And they had the fanciful name of Bushlegs. Can you talk a little bit about what that meant, to have the Russian people reliant on sort of gifted American poultry?
I think in general, the whole agricultural sector was one which was close to a disaster. When Khrushchev came to the United States, he was impressed with corn, and so he ordered, they had not grown much corn before. He ordered corn. Even Stalin's industrialization was based upon looking at the United States, and a lot of it was called Fordism, and so on. So it wasn't only in agriculture. It was in many areas. There were efforts to copy what we were doing, to borrow from it. The problem was the system. Russia was a grain exporter before the revolution. After Stalin's collectivization and famine, when I was ambassador to the Soviet Union, they were importing over 20 million tons of grain a year. Now, Russia, which has less than the grain-growing territory of Ukraine, for example, is an exporter again. There are areas of the Russian economy that, since the end of communism, have come back. But throughout, I think there was a great admiration of the United States and a borrowing, and they knew that our technology in many ways was more. And of course, one of the ways we put pressure during the Cold War was to try to deny them getting it. But on the other hand, they themselves are very inventive people, and even when they were competing, they would very quickly catch up with most of the things we did.
So you talked a little bit about that sort of triumphalism on the part of the United States. Were there people for whom that wasn't the case in the policymaking community? I mean, was there a segment in Foggy Bottom that said, now, wait a minute, this is not the approach we should be taking?
I don't think it happened quite that way. First of all, let me say that when we were negotiating an end to the Cold War, we set out, and I say this because I was called into the Reagan administration in early 1983. He was 2 years into his presidency, with the task of developing a negotiating plan to deal with the Soviet Union. And we spent a few months thinking over what we were going to try to do and what not to do. And one of the first instructions that went out later in 1983 was that we were going to try to develop the maximum amount of cooperation in areas where our interests were similar, and that we were going to try to convince the Soviets that many of the things they were doing were not in their interests. In fact, they weren't. But in order to do so, we had to treat them as equals. We had to treat them with respect. And this came easy with Ronald Reagan. He was very good, with other people personally. We were not out to change the Soviet system, though we hoped that we could encourage democratic changes and so on. But basically, we wanted to build down the barriers. Now, and before President Reagan met Gorbachev the first time, he wrote in his own handwriting his ideas about what to do. And there were several things in that we needed to remember. But the next to the last sentence was, whatever we achieve, we must not call it victory. He also said, when it comes to human rights, we're too upfront. If we hammer at them in public, we'll get cheers from our bleachers here, but we won't help the victims. In fact, we could hurt them. And he gave instructions immediately, we're going to do this privately, not publicly. So now, and this was, then I would add one thing here because it's very basic. In the very first meeting, Reagan and Gorbachev agreed to the following statement: a nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought, and that means there can be no war between us. This is still true, by the way, and it's something we have totally forgotten. But we were able to go to Gorbachev and the others with this and say, why are we building all these arms? We're not going to fight. That would be suicidal. Why are we robbing our people of these resources for something that are unusable and are dangerous? And, you know, it worked. Now, since the end of the Cold War, what do we have? We won. You lost, first of all. Second, you don't have the same values we do. What's that saying? We're an exceptional country. Well, you tell that to a Russian leader, it means the rules we talk about don't apply to us. We invade Iraq when they say, please don't do this, also the Germans and the others, illegally, by the way, and create problems for all of us. We don't consider that aggression. So, you know, they look at many of the things that we have been doing. And I would say that the triumphalism, and then we have gotten into what is almost I would say, a schoolyard shouting match, very personalized between our presidents, at least between President Obama and President Putin. What in the world do you get out of that except make people mad and have them an idea to get back at you? So, and I would, I don't want to go on too long in this, but one of the things I would recall is every time Ronald Reagan met a Soviet leader in private, and he would say the same thing in public, his first words were, we hold the peace of the world in our hands. We must be responsible. And with all of his criticisms of communism, he never once personally criticized a Soviet leader. So, you know, it's just hard for me to understand how we can, in effect, reverse our policies that brought an end to the Cold War and forgot the most important issue for this country's secure future and even survival, and that is the fact that nuclear weapons in the quantities in which they now exist are a threat to humanity. And if we don't deal with that correctly, nothing else is going to matter. And yet we let personal animosities, domestic politics, playing these games for the public to get cheers from the bleachers, as Ronald Reagan would say, at the cost, I think, of our ultimate security.
Well, let's look at some events that arguably were turning points in that post-Soviet relationship. Yes. Let's start with the bombing of Serbia. How did that look from Moscow?
Well, you know, first of all, we didn't have authority from the UN to bomb Serbia. That's an act of war. So that was illegal aggression. And of course, subsequently, we recognize Kosovo's independence. Now, the Helsinki Final Act, which we signed and the Soviet leaders signed, ruled that there could not be changes of borders without mutual agreement. And now, you know, we criticize, and rightly so, President Putin's annexation of Crimea, which he did after a referendum. But we set the precedent for that in Kosovo. And frankly, there were those of us there that said at the time, we are setting a bad precedent. We have said NATO is a defensive alliance. And when the Russians said, you know, why are you expanding? We're not threatening anybody. We said, oh, it's a defensive alliance. You've got nothing to worry about. Next thing they know, NATO is making war against Serbia, which had not attacked any NATO member, nor the United States, and without a decision of the UN Security Council authorizing it. So this was a case, and I think that, frankly, I think that that was more important even than the beginning of NATO expansion. And because many Russians, including young Russians, very educated young Russians, began to say, now, wait a minute, if they'll bomb the Serbs, they'll bomb us next if they don't like something we're doing here. We have to be afraid.
And another very pivotal set of events, the color revolutions, and,
yes.
and our support tacitly and perhaps not so tacitly of some of the regime change.
Well, they did see that our encouragement for mass demonstrations, and frankly, in these color revolutions in Ukraine, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, so-called, they started out with grievances against very legitimate abuses and problems. But, you know, we see how sensitive we are to what we perceive as interference in our elections. I mean, our representatives of many of our NGOs, some of which are funded by the American taxpayer, were out organizing the demonstrators and encouraging them. And, of course, what the Russians saw is an attempt by the United States to use former republics of the Soviet Union, which they had voluntarily given up without a fight, to turn them into bases against them. You know, when we see how we reacted to Cuba's relations with the Soviet Union, well, we should understand that that's going to upset people. But under the guise of democratization, we were supporting them. Now, at the time, I think it tended to pass, but increasingly, the Russians would say to us directly, you have a sphere of influence, we respect that. Now, respect ours. Now, they didn't mean we're going to create another empire. It just means stay out of our backyard militarily and with military alliances. And we should have understood that I think this is a very important matter, and that given the problems of these countries, they all were struggling with the problems that communism had created, the same ones Russia was. In the case of Ukraine, less successfully than Russia in many respects. So, you know, they required a lot of sympathy and so on, but the idea that suddenly these demonstrations could turn into democracies, I mean, there's just nothing in our historical experience that would, I think, support that as an assumption. This I think was unwise for us to continue that, particularly when it was combined with some of these other things, you know. And we walked out of the ABM treaty. and the treaty regarding anti-ballistic missiles. Now, this had been a foundation treaty on which we had ended the Cold War and the arms race in the Cold War, the nuclear arms race. But the second Bush administration took us out of it. That, to the Russians, said, you're no longer treating us, with respect. And so on. One could go into a lot of these, but basically what we had happening, I think, after the end of the Cold War was an illusion. Well, first of all, there were two superpowers before, and we ran the world. We didn't, the two superpowers. Now there's only one, and that's us. And this gives us the power to run the world. Well, it didn't. Sure, both of our countries, Soviet Union and the United States, could destroy the world many times over. The U.S. and Russia still can. But it doesn't mean you can create governments for other people. It doesn't mean you can spread your system through the world, or that your system is suited for other people.
Well, fast forward a few years, and Mr. Putin comes to power, and he famously once said, anyone who doesn't mourn the Soviet Union has no heart, but anyone who wants to put it back together again has no brain. So what do you think his sort of, at the most basic level, agenda for Russia is?
I think he wants Russia to be respected as a power. Now, he knows they don't have it, they're not as powerful as we are, but at least in their own neighborhood, we ought to respect that they have interests. They have the same interest in having close and friendly relations with Ukraine that we have, and have close and friendly relations with Canada and Mexico. So that's what he wants. Second, he does worry about the large number of ethnic Russians that were left outside Russia. And here again, I don't think he's trying to change borders, but he expects, he would expect countries like Georgia and Ukraine and Kazakhstan to be at least as friendly to Russia as Canada and Mexico have been to the United States. I think, and as we said before, the United States in many ways has been a model with all the differences between us. And frankly, most Russians can't understand why Americans don't grasp that.
Well, so we should just touch in the few minutes we have left on the interference in the American election. Do you think there was a purposeful plan, and what were they hoping to accomplish if indeed some of these things went on?
Well, first of all, it's very clear that I think most in the Russian government would have liked to see President Trump win. I don't think they thought he was going to any more than we did, most of us. Frankly, I think that to the degree that they were interfering, they were sending us a signal. And probably this signal was intended for Secretary Clinton, assuming she would win. Take us seriously. Because remember, President Obama had actually publicly said things like, Russia doesn't make anything anymore, et cetera. Really insulting stuff. Well, do you want to get in a cyber war with us, et cetera? Now, actually, while, Clinton had called Putin, had compared him to Hitler, Trump had said, look, it's going to be better to cooperate with Russia than not to cooperate. This may have been the only solid thing that he said in the campaign. But so I think that it's clear that sure, they'd like to see him win. They didn't think he was going to, but they were really, the signals were to us. And in their view, we have intervened and interfered, if you want to put it that way, messed around in not only their elections, but those with countries all around them. And so part of it is, we'll give you some of your own medicine. Having said all of that, Nothing I have seen has convinced me that what they did had anything to do with President Trump being elected. I think it's totally explicable on other grounds. And I think that all of the attention given to this is most unfortunate because it is making it much more difficult for us to do what we desperately need to do, and that is improve relations with Russia.
Well, we've probably got 30 seconds left. What is your elevator advice to policymakers going forward?
Remember, a nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought, and therefore there can be no war with a nuclear power.
Well, Ambassador Matlock, thank you very much. We'll keep an eye on that situation. And to our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
Thanks.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.